Welcome back to Educator.com. This is the lesson on taxonomy. So taxonomy is all about categorizing groups for organisms based on their evolutionary histories, their body forms, genetics, and various other characteristics. And when it comes to taxonomy, it's really a system of classification. You can classify anything in life. You can classify types of music, types of shoes, types of buildings. I mean, you would classify all kinds of things. That's part of being human. We like to differentiate and compare and contrast things. So when it comes to life, humans have had a desire to classify what is life and how life is different and how other life forms are similar. Well, ancient classification, very, very old, as you would guess from the word ancient. So classification systems pertaining to life were started by Aristotle and were used and relied upon for over 1,000 years. A very long time. Aristotle had three main groups, and depending on the textbook you look in, there'll be slightly different phrasings of this, but I've seen this very often, that he talked about animals with red blood, animals without red blood, and then plants. So basically, according to Aristotle, according to his observations, every life form on Earth was in one of these three groups. So yeah, you would imagine that humans and chickens and dogs would be animals with red blood. Perhaps you'd have an insect or a worm or maybe even a squid in this one. It's hard to say the entire list and all the different animals that he would have been exposed to in his lifetime. But based on his observations, he separated all animals in these two groups, and everything else was plants. So in the plant group, he would describe trees, obviously, and bushes, and probably would have even put mushrooms in that group. Now, we now know that mushrooms are not a plant. They are a fungus, and they're actually more closely related to animals than plants. But you gotta, I guess, cut Aristotle some slack that, living about 2,000 years ago, he didn't have all the tools we have today to figure out that a mushroom is, in fact, not a photosynthetic being like a plant. But, yeah, there were obviously some flaws to his system of classification. So plants were split up based on type. So further categorization underneath these little umbrella terms, he would have split up plants like, hey, that's a bush, that's a tree, etc. And animals were split up based on where they were found: water, land, air. Now there's a problem with that, right? Because when you have very strict kind of determining characteristics for that, like, oh, there's the water animals, there's the land animals, air animals. Well, what about a duck? A duck can be in all three. They can fly, they can, go through the water, and they can walk on land. So yes, obviously some problems with his system. However, up until the 1700s approximately, this was a commonly used classification system in Europe and beyond. So Aristotle, you, sir, definitely had a huge impact on classification, but thanks to the scientific revolution and a little bit more kind of reliable thought in terms of like testing it out and figuring out for certain, and went beyond just theory, and modern day classification is a little bit more precise. Modern classification. So thanks to this gentleman, Carolus Linnaeus, that was not his birth name. He actually Latinized his own name. And what I mean by Latinized is Latin is the base language that's used to name species and to kind of categorize life. And it's almost a way to advertise the system that he invented. He was born Carl Linn, or Linné. Okay, and so Carl, also you'll find it also written as Carl von Linn in certain sources. But Carl became known as Carolus Linnaeus because it almost sounds like a scientific name, right? Ornithorhynchus anatinus, that's the scientific name of the duck-billed platypus. I could do it to my own name. I'd be Bryanus cardelianus, or Bryanicus cardeliae, okay? But he did it with Carl Linn and Carolus Linnaeus. That name was born. So he was an 18th century Swedish biologist slash botanist, knew a lot about animals, knew a lot about plants, and that certainly helped in him coming up with this really good way of categorizing life into different groups. So his system of classification, still used today, even though it dates back to the 1700s, and it's known as taxonomy. And the different groups he came up with, from broad to specific, are called taxa, and you'll see that on a slide in the future in this lesson. Taxonomy is a discipline of biology concerned with identifying, naming, and classifying species. And it's based on several different criteria. We have the benefit of the evolutionary history, fossils that inform us about different forms of life. We have DNA. Of course, Carolus didn't, I almost sound like I said careless, but Carolus was not careless, but he did not rely on DNA, of course, because back then didn't know about that. But he relied on some fossil evidence and, of course, studying their bodily form and which ones were similar to others and which ones were different. And behavior, of course, can inform those things. But yeah, it's not just, putting them in different groups. It's naming them in the most specific way possible. And it's called a specific epithet. So every organism has its own distinct name. And the cool thing about his system, regardless of whether or not a scientist, knows Latin or speaks Swedish, whether a scientist speaks English, Swahili, Japanese, Russian, Portuguese, it doesn't matter. The same names are used around the world. Awesome.